Welcome to the Sales Enablement Innovation Podcast, brought to you by the Sales Enablement Collective. Each episode, we sit down with sales enablement and revenue leaders from around the world and invite them to share their expertise and experience with the community. On this episode, we spoke to Krystina Moustakis, sales performance specialist, about her advice for driving sales performance, including the importance of creating intrinsic motivation. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hey Krystina, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Hi, good to be here.
So before we dive into our topic for today, could you introduce yourself for our listeners and give some background on your enablement experience, your career thus far, and what you've been up to?
Yeah, for sure. So, way back when, I actually started as a high school English teacher and saw all of the interesting things going on in terms of people, motivation, performance measurement. So, went back to NYU to get my master's degree in organizational psychology. And then from there, went to ADP to work within sales and eventually going up into the innovation lab where I was actually building and piloting products with clients. So, still a big element of sales there. And throughout my time, I found working with the sales team, doing it, and then eventually doing sales enablement was so interesting that I kind of wanted to devote myself to it. And then that's where 4 years ago, I started my own firm, KrystinaM.com, where I work with mid-sized organizations to roll out enablement initiatives.
That's really cool. It's a really interesting background as well, kind of a little bit topsy-turvy in different places, which is like a lot of what you get in enablement, which is really cool.
Mhm.
So our topic for today is driving engagement through enablement. And to lead us in, why do you feel that this is important to talk about? Why is that sort of the core topic for today?
So that's always really top of mind for sales enablement because as the supporters of sales, we want to make sure that people are really hitting their highest potential. A lot of the people that I talk to in sales enablement are these, really pro-social people who want to create this really big impact and help people get to this next step in their performance. So as an organizational psychologist, I not only have experience firsthand like other sales enablement people, but then having the research behind it, being familiar with it, attending conferences, reading the journals, all that boring sciencey stuff. I'd love to sort of bring that in to help with enablement to get at that pro-social enabling sales, making them more effective.
That makes a lot of sense. And so when you're sort of thinking about driving engagement with enablement, like driving real engagement, do you have a sort of process or framework that you follow that our listeners could emulate? What does that actually look like for you when you come in as an enablement professional and you're thinking, okay, engagement, this is what I need to be driving. What does that sort of look like for you?
Mm-hmm. When it comes to that, there are three big steps that I really like to follow. The first is to align to the business and choose one specific metric with, ideally, I'd be working with the executive, but for anyone else, any senior leader on the project. Second is then I scope a realistic outcome. Okay, so we have the metric we're trying to affect. Now we want to be able to figure out what's your timeline? When do you need this by? What resources do I have at my disposal? Because we don't want to promise the world and then all of a sudden realize, wait a second, I can't do that. You're not giving me anything to work with here. Or maybe the population, the audience chosen might be a difficult one. So then third is to then showcase what it is that the success is based on that one specific metric that we've identified. And so by consistently showing like, here's the success we're having, here's the success we're having, that really helps to drive people to like higher levels of engagement to want to work with you. So that's the three steps. First, align to the business with one specific metric. Two is properly scope things out like audience, timeline, resources. And then three is showcase the impact that you are having.
100%. And when it comes to measurement like that, you talked about the one metric. That does that sort of the same metric every time? Like, do you have a golden metric that you tend to follow, or does that differ from sort of initiative to initiative, project to project? When you're sort of keying in on that one metric, how do you choose it? What's that sort of process look like?
Mm-hmm. So it changes initiative to initiative. And the reason for that is because the same problems don't necessarily exist in every organization, even though they may look the same. So, like, we all want to increase revenue generation or something like that. But ultimately, when you get into a meeting with an exec or you're talking to them about what their reality is they're trying to get to, they're going to see different versions of that in different ways. So, I can't tell you how many times I've been brought in to make a training, or, like we need to onboard people better. And in one company, it was actually that their attrition rates were high and they needed to help stem that attrition. And training, yeah, sure, was part of it, but not exactly what they needed. Another time where training was thought to be needed, it was actually because there was a process problem and the process itself wasn't really done correctly. So for them, the metric that we needed to focus on was how do we increase the number of completed projects for when it goes from sales to implementation. So both seemingly asking for this onboarding training, thinking that this is what's the real clincher, but in truth, they're two completely different problems.
That makes a lot of sense. And then seeing how you have to sort of choose the different metric based on that situation is interesting as well. But before we were sort of setting this up, we talked about intrinsic motivation a little bit as well. And I want to dive into that a bit. What does intrinsic motivation look like for sort of the different stakeholders involved in enablement? And do you sort of have advice for listeners who maybe struggle to create that intrinsic motivation in their organization among those sort of stakeholders?
Yes. So, intrinsic motivation is basically when people want to work with you without you having to force them to work with you. And so, after combing through all the theory and what we found that works, both through tangible means and also through theoretical ideas that people have, ultimately there are a few different ways that we can garner that intrinsic motivation. And the three steps that I chose in the way that I work with people that I mentioned before are all grounded within the major theories of motivation. So the first one is around the metric alignment with the exec. When you sit down and you have a meeting with someone and you say, hey, what do you think? What are you trying to get at? What do you think we should focus on? That helps to increase intrinsic motivation, because when people have control is so important. I am part of the conversation. I have control over the outcome. So I'm more willing to participate in it. And the exec had participation in the conversation. They were, contributing to the outcome. They feel like they have control too. And for all those enablement people out there that get forced into something and say, I didn't want to do this, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, and then the second about, the scoping, that second step of scoping the audience, the resources, the timeline, whatever. Clarity, role clarity is a huge intrinsic motivator. When you know what you can expect, it decreases anxiety, which decreases, any surprise endings. This way, when the exec comes to you and said, hey, I thought this was going to happen, and you're like, why did you think that would happen? This is what I thought was going to happen. And then marketing comes and says, hey, I thought this was going to happen. And then sales says, oh my gosh. So this role ambiguity causes a lot of issues. But when you have that clarity, it really helps people to say, I know what to expect. I know what I'm going to get within a certain timeline. And then the third, the showcasing. People, before they work with you, always go through some kind of mental question to themselves. Is the effort of working with this person worth the reward? So you'd say to yourself, oh, Krystina, do I want to work with her? Is the effort worth the reward? Is the effort worth the reward? And even though people aren't specifically asking this, it's going on in the back of their mind, and they're going to answer that for themselves. So if you can showcase your successes, it helps them to make that decision much easier. So, I mean, if someone's got low effort to work with and a high reward of working with them, people are going to choose them intrinsically every time. You don't have to pay them to do it or make them figure out how to make it work or force them or make it compulsory. So, big three intrinsic motivators: one, control over the outcome; two, clarity on what the outcome is; and three, showcasing your effect on that outcome. Huge intrinsic motivators.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's probably something that enablers don't think about enough. There's sort of so much to worry about already that then thinking about these sort of maybe more subtle factors isn't something that necessarily crosses their mind. But hopefully, our listeners will sort of keep that in mind as well. Talking about sort of stakeholders getting invested and creating this motivation, have you ever had experiences where sort of getting that involvement or face time was sort of difficult, or even you're sort of working your processes and there's maybe some more hurdles? How do you sort of overcome that? And thinking for our listeners who might end up in sort of similar situations, trying to build this intrinsic motivation and they're sort of struggling, even though they're putting their sort of best foot forward, How do you sort of approach that situation?
Yeah, so that's a really tough one. Being an external consultant, I face that all the time. Trying to get into the room with the people who make the decisions can be tough. And so, for example, one client that I was working with, I needed to get in touch with their VP so that I can figure out, okay, what capacity do you have to roll out this initiative that we're doing? And it was, people kept putting barriers in front of me of like, no, you can't talk to them. No, you can't talk to them. So what I wound up doing was trying to figure out what major goal does this align with in the organization. And constantly, when I would have conversations with anybody on this project, I would always say, hey, in order to align it with this, how are we going to move that forward? What kinds of things can we do here? And I would suggest things that have worked with other clients or things that are from the research to show I know what I'm talking about. You can trust me to speak to whoever needs to be spoken to. And eventually, after about a month of consistently showing up to these meetings with external research to show that this is something that happens within the industry, two was just showing from my own expertise and previous clients that I've worked with, and then three, asking these meaningful questions. It really helped to eventually get me that seat in front of the VP so that I can ask some of these tougher questions that people may have been a little bit more hesitant to put in front of them. And then eventually we were able to roll out the way that was needed so that we didn't have any hiccups in the plans.
That makes a lot of sense, and I love the sort of persistence behind it as well, and sort of really driving the importance of getting in front of those sort of decision makers as well. I want to ask, when you hear sort of return on investment or ROI in an enablement context, what sort of comes to mind? What does that look like for you? Because at the end of the day, like you said, like the showcasing, it comes down to that, like proving the value of sort of the work that you're doing as an enablement professional. What does that sort of mean to you? Where do you sort of look to prove that ROI? You mentioned the sort of one metric. Is that always enough to sort of prove that ROI? Is there sort of more pieces to that? How do you sort of see that picture?
Mm-hmm. So, thinking back to the example that I just gave, what I was really doing there was just driving value. And ROI is just another version of, it's just another piece of value. So, just like how a carrot is a vegetable, not all vegetables are carrots, but, all carrots are vegetables. It's the same thing with ROI. Think of ROI as a carrot, not the all encompassing category. And so, if we only think about ROI, what's going to wind up happening is if that's not necessarily valuable to someone, because some people might say ROI is valuable to them because they just have heard other people say it. And so when we think about how can we drive value, what is it that people actually want to hear about? We need to talk to those people and get to know them and understand them. Some people like that outside research. Some people like the clients like this have also experienced this. Some people like just like a logical argument. Some people like when you grab a coffee with them and relate to them on a personal level. And personal relationships are what drives the value. So if we focus just on ROI without knowing if that's truly valuable to them, can actually drive away the potential relationship or the potential forward momentum we can get. And if we even want to take it a step further, there's research that's been done where they were able to determine that when it comes to the way that you present data to people, you can actually wind up driving them away with the data.
That makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting to hear as well the fact that this the way you're presenting data, the things that you are presenting, even if you're coming at it from a sort of good idea, you have your best intentions behind it. It can actually sort of cause problems down the line. That's really fascinating. I'm wondering, in terms of sort of these initiatives and when you're sort of driving engagement through enablement, obviously that's not something that's going to happen overnight. Enablement professionals know that. When you think about timeline, though, what sort of expectations should listeners have in mind if they're sort of starting from scratch, trying to sort of build this culture of driving engagement? What sort of time frame are we talking about? What do you sort of tend to see in terms of the when you sort of start seeing the results of the sort of hard work that you're putting in using these sort of processes that you've been talking about at the moment?
Progress, not perfection, is always really important to remember, and celebrating any small wins along the way that you have. It really depends on how much pushback that you have. So, certain clients that I've worked with are incredibly receptive to the initiatives that we roll out and the way that we go about it. And we tend to see a difference within 2 to 3 months that creates enough of a momentum where people are bought in. In some people that have a little bit more of a difficult culture, you may never see the changes that you want in the way you want it. You'll see changes in the initiatives that you've done, but like that long lasting change, that might never happen. And those clients I personally don't love to work with. And if there's an especially motivated person within the organization trying to make change, then I will work with them. But sometimes you have to know, like, when can I actually make an impact? Look for those areas. And so usually as fast as 2 to 3 months, but as long as something like a year, as long as you have that consistency and you're finding cultural places where you can make use of that momentum to like drive this larger change.
I really like that. And I actually think that's a really important point about finding the right places where you can make an impact, because you might not necessarily be able to impact everywhere, which is sometimes hard to remember, but it's a good sort of perspective shift to have. I just want to ask, before we sort of wrap things up, if our listeners could only take one thing away from this conversation, what should that be? What do you think is sort of like the message that enablement professionals need to hear, that you're sort of really want to sort of drive home so that they can bring that back to their organization and hopefully make an impact and drive some engagement themselves?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I find is the most valuable about when I come into an organization, it's the fact that I am detached from it, so I can see it differently. And when you're in the mix of everything, it's a lot harder to make decisions because there's just everything's fresh in your mind. So one of the things that I find is most helpful is when I have a chat with these enablement people to say, let's take a step back. Let's sort of put things into perspective. Let's disconnect ourselves from the minutia and just sort of look at that larger piece. Where are we trying to get to? We're on Island A, we're trying to get to Island B, and what does Island B look like? And it makes the path forward so much clearer. It's not muddied by, executive mandates. It's not muddied by, sales and marketing constantly in your ear telling you do this or do that, or, so by taking that step back, you really give yourself a chance to remember what exactly is the point of what I'm doing and how can I get there the fastest way, and just sort of clear out the muddiness along the way.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. But Krystina, thank you so much for coming onto the show. I really appreciated it. Really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure our listeners will have taken a lot out of it as well. So just thank you for taking the time. It's much appreciated.
Yes, thank you for having me. And if anyone would like to join, I do a monthly webinar where we talk about how to have the impact in your organization. So if you visit my LinkedIn, you'll be able to see that registration link to sign up for the waitlist on the monthly. We usually have about 20 people who attend.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Krystina. Thanks for tuning in to the Sales Enablement Innovation Podcast. Be sure to follow us on your podcast platform of choice so you don't miss a thing. And if you're hungry for more sales enablement content, visit our website, salesenablementcollective.com, for articles, events, and an easy way to join our Slack community, home to thousands of your sales enablement peers.